So in this video, I'd like to outline my opinions on masculinity and essentially explain how I think a man is really supposed to act because there's all of this MGTOW stuff, there's all of this manosphere content, and you just hear about this all the time. You hear about Nick Fuentes making a certain comment on, how men are more attractive than women, or all of this like really annoying discourse, right? With Radfem Hitler and all this nonsense that pops up on the timeline every single day, right? So, first of all, this content is really, really negative. I really do not like talking about women. I don't like hating on women. I don't like obsessing over them. I already obsess over them quite enough. Okay, I think it's kind of a problem with me, and I really just I don't want to hear about girls anymore. I don't want I'm good. I think get I kind of get that there's something wrong with women, there's something wrong with feminism. Okay, let's not focus on this so much. But that's the thing, right? These guys talk about this every single day, every time some girl says something silly, they all have to jump in and just go on about this stuff and on and on and on and on. And clearly there's some sort of insecurity there, right? There's something not quite what it appears to be, right? Where they're trying to be like these tough guy alpha males, right? These emotionally dead hipsters. Like if you're really an emotionally dead hipster, then like does it make sense to be obsessing over women all the time? Like does it make sense to bring up women every single day of your existence? No. So clearly there's more that meets the eye. And I think what it is that the typical white nationalist is a very sensitive guy. He is way more sensitive than any other demographic in his country. That's why he was able to notice all of these very subtle things that are happening to his society. And this is really interesting because we typically associate leftism with sensitivity. But you think about it some more and you realize, they're not sensitive at all. They don't notice fine details. They don't notice, these subtle patterns, these very narrow patterns that right wingers obsess over. They can't understand second order effects or really anything particularly complicated that requires a lot of nuance. Leftist messaging is very simple. It's basically just everyone in power, everyone that's wealthy, is totally evil and they've done all these evil things, and everyone at the bottom is basically just a victim. And this sort of crosses into their opinions really coming from mass media, from cartoons or from movies, things that they've seen on television. One thing people don't know about Vladimir Lenin was that a lot of his ideas were actually influenced by a novel, this revolutionary melodrama called What Is to Be Done, and that later became the title for his manifesto, What Is to Be Done. So I don't really think it's appropriate to call these people sensitive. Okay, and I really question this narrative that they're the sensitive ones, and like we're the tough guys who like have to tell everybody the hard truth. Because I don't think that's exactly what's going on. I think the reason why white nationalists get involved is simply because they really, really love their nation. They really, really love the people in their lives, the people in their community. And they treat their race, they treat this extended family as a family, as sort of like their mommy, right? And I think the reason why leftism has historically been associated with sensitivity is just because of their virtue signaling, but also because they're very weak people. Like if you look at the men, they have these really sickly and weak physiques, right? Like I don't know if you've ever seen the Chapo Trap House guys, right? Like Matt Christman and all those dudes. They're really sickly looking. They're very, I mean, they just look unhealthy. And women are weak and leftist men are weak. Therefore, leftist men must be sensitive like women. But that's not actually the case. They are weak and they're also insensitive. They don't really care about anyone but themselves. And while it is true that what we think of as leftism is really a tendency towards tribal communalism, that utopianism is inherently selfish. It is inherently unrealistic, and it comes from a lack of empathy. Like it's empathetic in theory, and I'm sure in a real tribal situation, a real commune, that yeah, you'd have empathy and love and family and all that stuff properly developed, right? Properly organized. But this to them is almost like an intellectual exercise. They view it abstractly. They're not really fighting for people that they love because apparently they love everyone, and in which case their love is totally meaningless. They love rocks and they love trees and they love, you know, a random black guy on the other side of the world. And they love all these things just as much, if not more so, than their own families. So there's this misconception about leftism and sensitivity. And so it influences the way that the right views sensitivity. Now, this is important to keep in mind when talking about masculinity, because already we see that the right doesn't entirely understand how it works. And so they come to imagine that it's completely abnormal and strange for a man to in any way be sensitive, and that that's some sort of, leftist thing, leftist construction that was introduced to the culture somehow, even though it's totally normal and to be expected. But beyond that, beyond this association between leftism and sensitivity, there's also just a misunderstanding about how masculinity used to work. Because the impression that I'm getting is that everyone seems to think that the traditional male was just a badass. He was just this really detached, emotionless zombie, right? And he would just hide his feelings. He would never express himself. And if he ever did dare do such a thing, then he was just completely ridiculed and shamed, and that was the end of him. But that's simply not true. The history of masculinity is very complicated because it's also a class issue, and people don't really get this. The masculinity of the upper classes is going to be very different from the masculinity of the lower classes. And so in the past, you had the upper classes who were these very sensitive people, these people that could sense a lot of things, could feel things very deeply. You had these men running society and telling people what masculinity is all about. And so they encouraged a culture that was more sophisticated, intellectual, empathetic, that was concerned with transcendental values and elitism, venerating the higher things. And they would do stuff like write poetry, and sometimes they would wear makeup, you know, they wear powder and blush and all this nonsense. They wear dresses. They wear very elaborate dresses just like the women. And that's just because a civilization needs sensitive people running things. And so the culture will come to reflect, a more sensitive kind of man, right? That's not to say a feminine man. It's just to say that the man is more sensitive than the common Joe. A civilization is a complex system, and it's very, very fragile. And if you don't have the top minds, the people that aren't stupid, that can see patterns, that can get very narrow about the finer qualities of their system, their apparatus. If you don't have those people, then the system will degenerate and collapse. Now, something really interesting happens when you get the rise of the middle class. Suddenly, people that aren't very sensitive but are kind of uppity and kind of think of themselves as elites, those people introduce egalitarianism, and they mix up the lower and upper classes to where you have the peasants running everything, and the upper classes are just sort of getting scattered, right? They're no longer in these isolated bubbles where they're interbreeding and sort of creating a purebred aristocrat. All that stuff gets scattered to the wind. And then you get, like the rise of middle class literature, and you get all of these like really bad ideas from peasants, right? And one thing that happens is that you get something called the Great Male Renunciation. And this was basically a trend where men became more quote unquote masculine over time, where they stopped wearing these elaborate outfits and they started, you know, wearing suits and top hats and basically emphasizing their maleness. And this trend basically continued until the present, where any kind of sensitive hobby, any kind of, interest in dressing nice or expressing your feelings to a girl, all that stuff becomes gay. And so being a man is just about monster trucks and fighting and being a badass. And that's basically it. And that's what people like. And that is the masculinity of our time. And so if you go against this masculinity, well, then you are a pussy, you're gay, you are female, and there's really not a lot you can do about it. You just have this lower class peasant masculinity where, like one peasant will want to fight another peasant and they kind of they kind of have to like be tough, because they're drinking and doing whatever it is peasants do. And this creates a sort of funny situation where you have these ultra nationalist kids who believe that this vulgar masculinity is like the traditional masculinity that all men are supposed to have, and they're just not that. They're just very sensitive guys, and that's part of the reason. That's part of the reason why, some people have whispered that the far right is kind of gay, right? That there's a I'm not saying that they're all gay people or that even a very large portion of them are gay, but relative to what you would expect and relative to other communities, it does seem like they are kind of gay in a sense, and that a lot of their behavior is similar to that of homosexuals. And I have to be careful when I say this because people that don't really listen, they just automatically assume that, I must be trying to subvert the far right and its values. And that's not really what my intention is here. I'm really trying to address a problem that I see, which is this very distorted and deranged view of masculinity. This sort of almost like a body dysmorphia where people are just so insecure about who they really are. You have a lot of autistic men who are very easy to traumatize. And so you have a higher proportion of gay people in these communities, right? And that's why you have stuff like, like the third gym pact. That's why you have things like Yukio Mishima and Death in June. It comes from the simple fact that these guys are sensitive. Now, of course, sensitivity poses a real challenge for a man, given that he has peers and he also has to deal with women. Now, in a traditional society, I suspect that the way you really understand masculinity and the way that you really harmonize your true essence with your masculine role, I think you do this by understanding that you're supposed to become a daddy. So that's the code here to invoke Rapai. If you were to take all of the advice, all of the philosophy that's been written about dating, and you were to condense it down into the finest essence, I would say that that essence is the word daddy. And I mean this in both senses. A daddy is tough. He's a very tough guy, but he also has a sensitive side. It's just that
he doesn't put the woman in a role where she's being parentified because a woman is kind of childlike. And so to put the woman in sort of a parental role, in sort of a mommy role, she doesn't like that. She wants to be the baby. She wants to be daddy's little girl. Of course, it's not so explicit as this. It's a little more subtle than that. But this perfectly explains everything. That yeah, the lady wants, like a really tough guy who is basically her rock. But on the other hand, she also wants someone that will be sweet to the baby and, won't go crazy and kill her. Now, what's interesting about this is the way that the man shows his feelings in this kind of relationship. Because when you have sort of a child that is like really dependent on you for their emotional stability and so forth, you don't really want to scare them. It just comes natural to you that you don't want to scare the baby or think, that, you can go to the baby for advice. So the man's masculine role isn't necessarily something that needs to be taught. It just comes natural. It's just sort of a logical extrapolation, just an extension of empathy. And what happens when a man accounts for that is that he can be authentic, and this is sort of the experience that I've had where, when I'm calm, when I'm very confident and certain of myself, when I'm paying attention to the girl's feelings and, not trying to scare her or put her in a parental role, I can just sort of open up and be myself. It becomes a far more harmonious relationship. And that's the key. Traditionally, our relationships would have been harmonious. In other words, they would have used very little effort. And that's because, as Zip points out, all systems economize for least effort. So the traditional routines would have consumed very little effort. They would have been automatic processes. And so my best advice for anyone that is suffering from insecurity is to be yourself, as the cliche goes. Cliche advice is actually pretty good. And also understand that you're supposed to act like a daddy. You don't want to act like some emotionally dead idiot who is totally closed off, who has this, defensive detachment, which is, by the way, very common among homosexuals. You kind of want to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? On the set of Predator, where he's smoking cigars and, everyone's just really relaxed around him because he's in a good mood. He can beat up anyone that threatens them or whatever. You don't want to be this negative, cynical guy who is always self-aware, who is always meta about everything, who cares a lot about what other people think about him. People like that just really suck, and I just see them as degenerate. And so my personal opinion is that we really need to start promoting humility and sort of an aristocratic way of looking at things, where we recognize this class distinction between the peasants and the sensitive young men.